Hello, everyone, and welcome again to our Tuesday morning class. I'm glad you have joined us, and I want to begin by trying to explain what I'm going to try to talk about this morning. The topic is, what is the Talmud? And that is a huge question, and I can only begin to deal with a small part of the topic. If we were here in person, if I had better equipment, if I knew how to use that equipment, I'd show you what the Talmud looks like. I have a set in the office. It is 20 folio volumes, big pages. In the middle of the page, in a small block of text, is the text of the Talmud, and surrounding it, commentaries. So this isn't just a text, it's a text with commentaries, and in the back of the book, even more commentaries. As I said last time, when we see a picture, whether it's a photograph, an oil painting, a sketch of a Jew, and it has to be an old one, and a male with a white beard, studying a book. The book is the Talmud, not the Bible. And he, and this is before women started studying these things, he would be studying the Talmud, or better yet, the commentaries on top of the commentaries. The origin of the Talmud, about the year 220 or something like that of the Common Era, with a collection of writings known as the Mishnah. This is after the Bible, a different kind of written material completely. Not a book of stories, not a book of history, but primarily, and I'm focusing on this because there's another aspect as well, but primarily for my purposes, a book of legal discussions. Not a law book, but legal discussions. The debate, here's what this one says, here's what that one says. Sometimes there's a conclusion, sometimes there isn't. I don't know if that helped in the slightest. Now, another way of looking at the Talmud, and I want to do this at another time in another place, is to look at the Talmud through history, primarily through the history of Christian Europe, because the Talmud was a hated collection of writings. When the Christians who tried to convert Jews to Christianity figured they could reach us more effectively if they studied Hebrew, in doing so, they realized there were more sacred books that we had other than the Bible itself, other than what they called the Old Testament. They saw there was this thing called the Talmud. They called it blasphemous because it broke away from what they understood the biblical text to be. And in many cases, they thought they saw anti-Christian material. The fact that Jews didn't accept the Christian message was anti-Christian enough, but still they found certain material. And if you want, again, another time, another place, we can look at that. So throughout the early Middle Ages and going right up until the 20th century, there were public burnings of the Talmud. The Talmud that I have is censored. It is the censored edition. The Christian censors, oftentimes there were Jews who converted to Christianity because who else would be learned enough to know what the text meant, told us what we could or could not include. And sometimes when you know a censor is about to come, you self-censor. You leave certain things out in advance. Well, that's not exactly where I want to go today, though you can, I hope, pick up on some of the enthusiasm of my interest there. Next week, we're going to talk about the prayer book and our prayers. And I want to connect the Talmud with this. Now, again, backtracking. The most important, historically, Jewish service every week is on Shabbat morning. The centerpiece of that service is a Torah reading, a reading from the 5 books of Moses. How does that reading take place? Who has determined what you read when, in what order? What we do now is start at the beginning and go all the way through in a year. What is the ritual, for example, of taking the Sefer Torah, the Torah scroll, out of the ark? What is the ritual of putting it back in? All these practices customs, rules, traditions developed over the ages. I'm going to talk about one in the religious service that I'm going to connect, I think, with something you're familiar with. That paragraph, and it's really not a paragraph, but anyway, the paragraph that we call V'ahavta. It's really not a paragraph because the paragraph begins with Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha. Now you're going to say, what happened to Baruch Shem? That was added later. And in more traditional synagogues, if you've had that experience, you will hear that muttered silently. It's not sung the way we do it. We are saying that God's kingdom is eternal. In other words, the Romans aren't. There's a political aspect to this. So go down the page. You read, you're supposed to think about these words and speak of them. And here's where we're being specific. When you lie down and when you rise up. Now, at the beginning of one of the sections of the Talmud, there is a discussion as to when, in fact, do you recite the Shema. And Shema isn't just that one sentence. It's the benedictions before and the benedictions after. Where does all this come from? It's certainly not in the biblical text. All we have is that you're supposed to do it when you lie down and when you rise up. When's that? You lie down in the evening, you rise up in the morning, unless you're working the night shift, and the rabbis of the Talmud, I don't think, dealt with stuff like that too much. But what time? And what if you're late? And what if you forget? And then the discussion also has to deal with when you lie down, or is it when you are in the process of lying down? Or is it just at the time when you were lying down? And there was a debate on this. Do I have to be sort of on the side of the bed and sort of about to recline? Do I have to be in the process of getting up out of the bed? Well, the rabbis said no. Evening and morning. Now, for those of you who are familiar with traditional Jewish prayers, and we traditionally have had services 3 times a day, evening, morning, and afternoon. The afternoon service is a quick, easy one. You don't read the Shema and the benedictions before and after and so forth in the afternoon, because the biblical text just says, when you lie down and when you rise up, evening and morning. Now, how do you translate? And I don't mean from one language to another. I mean from one sentence into practice. How do you translate this biblical command into reality? How do you do it? It's not just a matter of saying it, singing it, thinking it. And the rabbinic tradition spelt out all these details, and the beginning of it is in what we would call the Talmud. For those of you who know of something about this, I am simplifying and I'm abbreviating, and I can't do it any other way at this stage of the debate. Now, I'm going to give you another example. We don't just talk about things, we do things. It's this time of the year when people are starting to think about Thanksgiving. And I'm going to share with you right now, and there'll be something in our weekly blast also, that every year we have a community Thanksgiving service on Longboat Key. We had an organizational meeting last week to try to figure out what's possible and what isn't possible. We're going to do another meeting next week, but we're not going to do what we normally do, having a full sanctuary of people with all kinds of refreshments and socializing afterwards. Obviously, we can't do that, and I'm discouraging people from attending. We want to stay as distant as we possibly can. Many of us in these Thanksgiving services read that section from Deuteronomy, and you shall eat, and you shall be satisfied, and you shall praise the Lord your God. In rabbinic terms, in other words, what the Talmud says and understands this is a proof text for the Birkat HaMazon, the long words of thanksgiving that you say after every meal. And I'm going to say something about that next month in our discussions. The Talmud deals with all kinds of unbelievable practical situations, comparable to, but not the same thing as a law book. It says we're supposed to be fruitful and multiply. When have you fulfilled that obligation? One school of thought said, when you have a son and a daughter. Another school of thought said, when you have two sons. Males are privileged, there's no debate about it. There was a compromise, so you can get both in. You have two sons and you have two daughters. But you and I know we don't determine those things, whether we can have children at all, or whether we have boys, whether we have girls. What if, and these are Talmudic discussions, you have children, you also have grandchildren. God forbid, your children die, you're still young enough to procreate. Have you fulfilled that obligation through the children and the living grandchildren? These are the kinds of discussions that are necessary in any society. Most people want to avoid it. But just think of all the things that we deal with in our society. Can I deduct that or can't I for my taxes? The rabbis dealt with this sort of stuff in the Talmud. And what has always interested me, there's so much that interests me, I know, but what really is interesting to me, and where I'm going to deal with this next time, is our liturgy, our prayers. I was more familiar with the prayer book before I started studying anything in the Talmud. And when I read all this stuff, a better word is study, in the Talmud, I said, I know what that is. I know what that is. The beginnings of what we have in any prayer book, whether it's an Orthodox prayer book or Mishkan Tefillah, you can see the structure and a good amount of the words already there in the Talmud. Something that you're not going to find, let's say, you're not going to find this in the biblical text. There are a lot of Psalms from the Bible that are in our prayer book. There are things like paragraphs like Ve'ahavta, which are lifted out of the biblical text. But who decides who does what, when, and how? This is Talmudic. Now, we as modern Jews have done really what Jews have done throughout the ages. We've adapted and we have changed, except we have done it more than any other generation. We have changed our prayer book around. We have certainly abbreviated. We have had, as we see in Mishkan Tefillah, a more traditional text on the right-hand side and more modern options on the left-hand side. This is part of a process that has been part of Jewish history. Nobody in the traditional world wants to admit this, but we've been doing this. I write a prayer to fulfill this need. You write a prayer that fulfills the same need. Yours is good and mine's not so bad either. Why choose? We'll put both of them in. Or a different approach is, the Jews of this part of the country did it this way, and this part of the country did it this way, and over to the east they did it a different way. And when the printers come into play, because the invention of printing plays a major role, the printer wanted to sell his books to as many people as possible. He put all three in so you could have each option there. What's permitted? What isn't? We spend a lot of time today, and I want to say, unfortunately, that we have these debates as to who is a Jew. It has become a major political issue in Israel. It's an issue in this country if somebody from a non-traditional family wants to marry into a very traditional family. The origin of the debate is in the Talmud. What are the rules? Somebody comes. I haven't had many requests, by the way, since I've been here for conversion to Judaism. In fact, if I've done any conversions since I've been here, I don't think so. In other congregations, I get curious people, seekers, and so forth. And what does it involve to convert to Judaism? When is the line crossed from being a non-Jew to a Jew? The Talmud deals with this. And maybe we in the Reform movement are very, very lenient, and maybe in Orthodox Judaism, not so lenient at all. There's a continuum, but it's all based on the Talmud. So I'm going to focus next time, and I'm looking ahead already. I'm going to focus next time on our prayer book, and our here means Mishkan Tefillah, what you are used to when you come to a Friday night or Saturday morning service, or hey, why not one of the festival services, or Mishkan HaNefesh for the high holidays. The Jewish world has always been a developing world. So has any society, or in my humble opinion, any system of law that can survive. If I want to find out what we as Jews have said about whatever, I may start with the biblical text. But if I stop there, I've missed the point completely. I have to see how different generations through the ages either dealt with the text or dealt with things that weren't even in there. Now, this day and age, we are being told constantly to wash our hands. To wash our hands in 21st century world, not America, but at the world, it's a world problem. You use soap, you use hot water, you do this for a certain length of time, you make sure you scrub properly, etc. There is a concept of hand washing in the Talmud. There's a whole section, Yadayim, hands. That kind of washing is different. You have a laver, a pitcher, and you pour and you pour. And it's a ritual act. It's not an act for control of disease. However positive any of this may be, people weren't aware of cause and effect the way we are today. Hand washing was very important. Before you ate, all right, why do I have Thanksgiving on the mind? Because everybody's putting Thanksgiving stuff up all over the place, and it's caught in between the other holy days of Halloween, where again we have a challenge. What do we do in terms of giving out treats to little kids who come around here? Do we want to have contact with them? And Christmas, okay? It's a big commercial thing. Now, before we eat, historically, we are supposed to ritually wash our hands, and how you do this is spelled out in the Talmud. You say the appropriate blessing if you're having a real meal, and real meal, again, how do you define a real meal? There's bread there. Bread equals food. Lechem can mean either bread as we understand it, or it can mean food, a meal. And you conclude that meal with the Birkat HaMazon, with words of praise and thanksgiving to God, and how that is spelled out. It didn't come out of nowhere. It's not lifted out of the biblical text. It's there in the Talmud. Now, before I conclude this, I want to say there are other aspects of the Talmud that are fascinating too. A lot of interesting ethical and moral stories, debates as to just what's right and what's wrong, as opposed to specific examples of, how shall I say, clearly defined legal prescriptions. But it is a kind of material that it involves a lifetime of study to think you can even begin to understand and master. I'm a complete amateur at that. Now, there's a Jewish tradition that says you're supposed to be modest. I'm not just being modest. I did a few required courses, and I've studied some more after that, and there's certain sections that are of real interest to me and so forth, fine. And there's certain sections that I've turned to because of their historical interest. But it's a challenging thing, because you don't just challenge yourself by studying those 20 folio volumes, but you study it in addition with all the commentaries. Now, is the Talmud a closed book? Is it an open book? There are translations. By the way, I didn't even mention this. The Talmud is partially in Hebrew and partially in Aramaic, and sometimes in the middle of the sentence it goes back and forth. For those of you who have ever had the experience of speaking two languages at once and going back and forth, you don't think twice about anything like this. More about that in another session too. Translations are available, but half the time the translations are incomprehensible because you have the answer to the question, but you don't know what the question was, or you don't know the background of the question. So more and more material is being made available in English for people who can. Here is a long introduction so you can begin to understand this sentence. And I said in English because another session, and I'm thinking ahead, and I always used to say in one of my previous congregations, there should be somebody who's writing down all the promises that I'm making for whatever classes I'm offering. The term is the Englishing of Judaism. For our sacred texts that were never available in anything other than the original language are now being translated into English. And it makes it a lot easier for people who don't know Hebrew and Aramaic at all, or better yet, for those who have something of an awareness but need something to help them along the way. So, when I decide to lead a service, I may just pick up the book and read what's in the book. But if I wanted to be creative, and there used to be, the end thing was to do creative services, mimeographing. Every congregation did it. If I were to do a thing like that, I could either go off the wall and do whatever I wanted, or I could follow at least something resembling a pattern. And that pattern would be what the Talmud essentially taught me. And there would be a core to the service, and the core would be what we call the Amidah, the standing prayer, what in our prayer book is called the Tefillah, 18 benedictions on weekdays. It's called the Shmona Esrei. Shmona Esrei means 18, but really they're 19. I think things should be simple, and it's never that way. 19 on weekdays, 7 on Shabbat, 7 on the festivals, 7 on Yom Kippur, 9 on Rosh Hashanah, all right? Before that, you have the Shema and its benedictions, starting with Baruch Hu. All the preliminaries, and it's almost as if it's a chaotic mess until you are led through it. When I was thinking about the prayer book in another context the other day, I thought of a prayer book that was published in England way over half a century ago, the Hertz prayer book. Some of you are familiar with the Hertz Pentateuch, the Hertz Chumash. And for the benedictions in the Shmona Esrei, the 18 but really 19, as each one is in the book, in the margin, there is the number, so you know which one. You know there are sections, and you know how the sections are divided up. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is next week, God willing, because we have to say that, we have no idea where we're going to be or what the world is going to be like. Next week, we will look at how the Talmud and our prayer book are connected. Now, I have one more thing to say, and then we can have some discussion. Earlier on, I worked out a schedule of classes for Tuesday mornings in November. I'm not doing a class on the 24th because that is the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, and that afternoon we're doing the community Thanksgiving event, and I think enough is enough. Now, November the 3rd happens to be on a Tuesday, and for those of you who don't vote by mail or don't vote in advance and all of that, my part of the discussion is recorded, so you won't miss that. And I hope as many of you as possible will be able to attend. And if not, we can always continue this conversation. So I'm going to conclude right now, and then we will discuss a bit.